Hey, Dr. Wilson here. I'm a molecular and structural biologist, and I'm back to debunk some more COVID-19 misinformation. This week I'll be addressing Bill Maher, who recently had two evolutionary biologists come onto his talk show and spread the conspiracy theory that SARS-CoV-2 was made in a lab. It wasn't, and these two evolutionary biologists give surprisingly bad information on his show, which Bill Maher just eats right up, and I'm sure his audience did too. But make no mistake, the information that these two biologists pushed on Bill Maher's show is not supported by the best science that we have. And I'm going to be explaining all of that in this video. So let's get started.
It certainly is a 50-50, would you say that?
It's far more likely than that.
Well, the data, history, and most scientists disagree with that. But let's hear what he has to say.
There are lots of viruses that can escape from nature and infect people, but in general, they don't have a second trick. That is to say, they can infect you, they can make you sick, maybe they can kill you, but they can't jump to the next person. And so what's really conspicuous about this virus is that it had both tricks from the get-go.
Okay, so he's talking about this idea that because SARS-CoV-2 was so good at spreading from human to human right from the beginning, that it must have had some sort of lab origin. But this is not necessarily true by any means. SARS-CoV-2 being well adapted to humans early on can mean lots of things that we know happen in the course of viral evolution. You see, a virus like this usually starts out in an animal, like a bat, and it can jump from animal to animal before it jumps to humans. Along the way, it could have picked up mutations that allow it to enter human cells much more easily and thus be transmitted between humans much more easily. Another option is that it could have jumped to humans far earlier than when it was first detected in Wuhan. This would give the virus time to adapt to humans and develop ways for it to spread more efficiently between its hosts before we actually detected it. This is actually a possibility that the WHO is strongly considering in their upcoming investigation on the origins of SARS-CoV-2.
I heard at the beginning of this that they usually get milder viruses as they mutate because they want to survive. They don't want to kill anybody, then they got no host.
You might expect that a virus that did emerge from a lab that was doing gain-of-function research would precisely not do the thing that wild-type viruses would do, that it might exactly do what we seem to be seeing. Get more virulent, get more pathogenic.
Well, I've heard that too, but it's actually not a rule, and it's a little concerning that these evolutionary biologists didn't correct him on that. You see, as long as a virus has enough time to spread from one host to the next before it kills its first host, then it has no evolutionary pressure to become less virulent. And as we now know, SARS-CoV-2 can actually be transmitted before the patient actually shows any symptoms. So it's really not surprising that it's evolving to become more contagious. This is definitely not evidence that it was made in a lab.
The expectation amongst those who have been seriously investigating the question of whether this is a gain-of-function lab escape virus is that the virus would have been passed through either animals in the lab or tissues in the lab in order to use evolution to re-rig it. And that means that effectively tension was put on the virus, pulling in the direction of certain things. Some of those things were intentional, like infectivity of human cells, which may have given it extra capacities like this Furin cleavage site that no other virus like this has, but SARS-CoV-2 does.
I'll come back to the first part of what he said before the end of this video, but for now, he's wrong about the Furin cleavage site. Although the Furin cleavage site on the spike protein in SARS-CoV-2 is unique, it is not uncommon to find Furin cleavage sites in coronaviruses. It is perfectly possible that the Furin cleavage site on this SARS-CoV-2 protein was acquired naturally.
Many of the characteristics, the fact that this virus attacks so many different tissues in the body, does not seem natural.
Well, actually it is natural, and we can kind of explain it. You see, the protein that the virus needs in order to enter human cells, ACE2, is expressed in lots of different human tissues, which means that the virus can infect lots of different tissues. So again, we don't need this lab-made idea in order to solve this mystery.
The fact that it does not at least at the beginning, did not seem to transmit outdoors nearly at all is very conspicuous. I mean, after all, most animals live outdoors. So a virus that seems to be adapted to indoor transmission is a bit conspicuous in this case.
Well, bats actually crowd together in caves. And this is not weird. Respiratory viruses are known to be more effective at spreading when people are indoors. That's because the air indoors is more often stagnant, and people are more likely to be close together indoors. This is not new information. In fact, it's for those reasons that you've probably heard of things like mask wearing, social distancing, and good indoor ventilation as really effective ways of preventing the spread of not just SARS-CoV-2, but most respiratory viruses.
Whether or not this virus emerged from a lab or not actually has implications for how it is likely to behave now that it's out in the world, and how, therefore, we should imagine how likely these things are going to be going forward.
Well, no, we have the genome of SARS-CoV-2, so whether or not it came from a lab or emerged naturally, that's not going to affect where it goes in the future. But what is important about knowing where it came from is knowing how to prevent these things from happening in the future. That's why it's important to understand where this virus came from. It took a path from an animal to humans, which means that we need to be really careful about how we treat animals and the environment. Because whenever we significantly disrupt natural habitats or take lots of different species and crowd them all together in the same space, then we are putting ourselves at risk of being exposed to brand new viruses that have chances to infect a new host, us. Given enough time and enough chances, a virus is bound to get good at infecting humans eventually.
So we should have been paying attention to the lab theory at the beginning, but we didn't because it was politicized, really is the moral there.
No, the moral of the story is to listen to science. That's because right from the get-go, right from the day that this virus's genome was sequenced, it was blindingly obvious that it was not made in a lab. You see, the closest relative to SARS-CoV-2 is another coronavirus called RATG13. Now, if you were to make SARS-CoV-2 artificially, you would have to start with a backbone. You would have to start with something to work with. And that, in this case, would be RATG13, or a virus really similar to it. So, if SARS-CoV-2 was made in a lab using a virus like RATG13 as a backbone, then most of the differences between the two viruses would have to be what the scientists created. But when we look at the SARS-CoV-2 genome and compare it to the genome of RATG13, we don't see that. Instead, what we see is much more consistent with natural evolution. There are about 1,200 letters in the SARS-CoV-2 genome that differ from RATG13. Almost all of these letter differences are just single letter differences that are scattered throughout the genome. This makes absolutely no sense for scientists to have done in a lab. Instead, this is much more consistent with natural viral evolution over a span of decades. Because over time, you would expect these one-letter differences to accumulate all over the genome in random places, because mutation over time is random. And finally, there isn't even any documented evidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was working with viable, live RATG13 virus. They only had sequences of this virus. Having a sequence of a virus is not the same thing of having a viable viral particle. There is currently no evidence that they were even doing any gain-of-function studies on these viruses, and to assume so would be a conspiracy theory. As always, all of the science, information, and databases that I use in this video are linked in the description below, so you can read them and check them out for yourselves. After all, I'm not an authority, I'm just telling you what the science says. And of course, thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed this video and find it useful in any conversations you might have with conspiracy theorists in your life. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe so you can catch me next week, where I'll be debunking some more funky stuff. See you then.